Good evening, welcome, and thank you for joining us for this part of the Transformational Leadership Series at Yale Divinity School. I'm Bill Gettler. I'm an Associate Dean for Ministerial and Social Leadership, and I'm glad to be hosting this conversation, which is part of a weekend-long seminar at Yale Divinity School. We are joined by YDS alum and journalist Kelsey Dallas. Kelsey, welcome back to Yale.
Thank you for inviting me.
Kelsey covers religion, politics, and the Supreme Court for the Deseret News in Salt Lake City, Utah. Serves as an associate editor on the national team of that paper. Her writing has been widely recognized by the Religion News Association, the Religion Communicators Council, and the American Academy of Religion. She serves on the association's membership committee. Kelsey holds a master's degree from Yale Divinity School and bachelor's degrees in English, economics, and religious studies from the University of Iowa. She grew up in Southern Illinois and now lives in Utah with her husband and toddler son and a house full of pets. We're so glad that you've joined us. We've already begun the class this afternoon. We have a great class here on the other side of the cameras, but they'll be part of the conversation in just a little bit. For our conversation this evening, we're going to focus on writing religion and the Supreme Court. A great topic. But first, Kelsey, would you tell us a bit about your writing life at the Deseret News? What's your beat? What do you cover more broadly?
I've been at the Deseret News almost 8 years now, and the whole time, in some way, I've been focused on covering religion. But people at YDS know more than probably people anywhere else that religion can be many things. It's a huge topic. There are all sorts of articles that could be written. And so I've always had some specific coverage areas, which are topics like religious freedom, or the role faith plays in people's family life. And so that's evolved over time. And then currently, I also help with some editing of our faith and family coverage. And so I work with a small team and help decide what coverage areas that we focus on.
And in the midst of that writing, you've claimed or found a direction of writing particularly about issues related to religion in the Supreme Court. How'd you get there?
Well, it started with an interest from my organization, which was the topic of religious freedom. And in general, the religious freedom beat would cover opportunities for people to live out their faith in public, to bring their religious identity with them into the public square. But there are only so many stories that you can write that just say, yay, religious freedom, let's all support it. I was really looking for opportunities to find the hard news related to religious liberty. What's the latest breaking developments, and where are there real challenges arising? And I think that all signs pointed to the Supreme Court, even before we got the balance we're at today, where a bunch of the cases that they hear each year have to do with faith in some way. The other note I'll make is that just in journalism in general, individual reporters have a beat. Like I said, religion is what I was hired to cover. But in religion, it really helps to try to specialize in a specific topic within religion, and that's where you can kind of make your mark and help yourself stand out on the national landscape, which is what I was hoping to do.
Can you think of a couple of the early stories that you wrote about the Supreme Court?
Oh my gosh, I'm sure it was something horrifying if we went back and look at it, just mistakes being made. But I think that one of the first cases that I dug into really seriously was Masterpiece Cake Shop, which was the battle over a Colorado Christian baker who said that he did not want to bake a cake for a same-sex couple. It rose all the way to the Supreme Court. And the reason I remember covering it is that I worked very hard to dig into the actual legal briefs that were filed. So this dry language about what's the precedent that the justices should consider. And I wrote one that was all of the groups that were supporting the baker and one that was all of these groups that were against the baker. And I tried to really bring the voice of both of those communities to my readers and say, hey, you might find yourself in one of these camps, but it's really important for the country that you understand the other side as well. And so that really started a journey where for almost every faith-related case in front of the court, I do that type of initial overview of the briefs, a look at the oral arguments, and then a final story about the ruling. And I try to take that approach, although the Supreme Court is making it really hard for me these days because they just keep taking more and more religion cases every year.
But they're not always expressly religious.
Well, the ones that I feel most accountable for are the ones that it's really a religious person making a religious freedom claim. But you're right. This year, for example, there are battles over abortion rights, there are battles over gun rights, and even bigger questions about voting rights have a lot of religious involvement. And I do what I can to try to watch those as well. But as I think we'll discuss later, I have to be careful not to turn into a Supreme Court reporter, that I need to watch out for the broader landscape of religion as well.
So somebody reading your story, will they finish the story knowing that they've read a religion story?
Well, they will definitely know that I interviewed a lot of religious people, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
That it's not that I'm talking to a general attorney or a general legal expert. It's someone who has worked very specifically at the intersection of law and religion. And it's often pastoral voices even. And so I think they'll know that something is afoot. There will be faith all over the place.
Uh-huh. Do people want to read this stuff?
That's a good question. I think that I wish more people did, because as I've really dove into this topic, I love it, and I find myself talking about it at perhaps inappropriate moments. My own husband, who has nothing to do with journalism and really not that much to do with religion, will reference cases from 5 or 6 years ago, and that's where I know he's really drank the Kool-Aid of my life. So it's interesting because as a reporter at the Deseret News, as I mentioned, we care quite a bit about religious liberty. I would be writing these stories even if they were the lowest page views we see, because there's just a investment in the topic and a hope that we're going to get more people to care about it. But it doesn't feel good when a story goes out and there's not a lot of viewership. And so that's something I regularly wrestle with, because these stories have a way of becoming far too maybe in the weeds, far too academic. How do you write a headline that will grab someone's attention when they could care less about the Supreme Court?
And you do that, I mean, you said by a lot of interviews. How is it that you draw them into rather complicated issues? They probably have some thoughts about faith, your readers, and they might have some vague opinions about the issue before the court. How do you put those together?
I try to talk about the stakes of the ruling more broadly, not just for that one Christian baker, for example, or that one same-sex couple that was seeking a wedding cake, but for the country as a whole. What does this ruling mean for us as a nation, and where do we go from here?
Do you get pushback?
Well, I think that there is concern about who you get reactions from. We've been talking about this in the class so far today. You can't quote every single person with a view on the case, but you have to do your best to say who are the people with the biggest investment in this issue. And I try to stick to those who have filed legal briefs and who have really put in the legwork to help shape the Supreme Court's thinking. But in the cases that have to do with LGBTQ rights in particular, you're going to end up quoting some groups that people on the other side would think are just out of left field or out of the polite company or something. And so yes, there is definitely pushback that says, I don't want to hear what that person feels about this ruling because I don't care about their opinion.
So you're a person of faith. How does that play out in your own exploration of these issues?
Well, I think that my own upbringing in church and just the way, as I've gotten older, that I've come to see the really important foundation that my childhood church gave me, and the way that it sort of gave me this path to follow that led me to YDS and then to this career. It just helps me see how sometimes religion, it can be an invisible force, sometimes a very visible force, but it is at work in the public square and it is at work in people's lives. And so it made me attuned to the topic. And that's what I think still guides me as I do this work, is that I know that the church, even as membership is on the decline and as attendance is dropping, is still this intensely important institution that I feel really lucky to get to track.
You're not a member of the Church of Latter-day Saints, is that right? But you are writing to an audience, a readership who might well be.
Yes.
How does that play into this work, to this beat, to this exploration?
Well, it can be incredibly surprising the ways that it does play out. So I initially came to the Deseret News thinking, oh, it'll be so wonderful to write for an audience that cares so deeply about religion. And what I learned very quickly is that they care a lot about religion, but sometimes it's just their religion. So I would talk to people at conferences at Brigham Young University, for example, who said, oh, I don't really care about the faith page because that's like everybody else. Like, I'm going to read the church-focused content. And so I realized, oh, wow, I'm really going to have to stand out to grab even these core readers' attention. But what I appreciate is that I think that Latter-day Saints are very thoughtful about the topic of faith and then religious freedom, because one of the stories that led to where they're at today in Utah was one of persecution and sort of clinging to religious freedom rights in order to keep their faith alive. And so they take seriously these protections, and they then are able to reach out across faith lines to support their Muslim neighbors, to support their Jewish neighbors. And so even though there is sometimes that I only run to read about myself, I think overall they're very open to religion reporting.
Let's go back to the Supreme Court and think about the justices.
Mm-hmm.
Is their faith a part of your, whether they hold faith or not, is that a part of your story?
Well, I don't think that I've written much about what justices are members of what faiths. Perhaps I've only done that in stories about someone who's been nominated and sort of what to expect, what's their biographical information. But I do think that it's important to keep in mind that as far as we know from outside observation, they are people of faith, or at least were raised in a faith tradition. And I think that means that they carry that same assumption that I described earlier into the cases, that even though some of them might be more likely to rule against religion than others, I don't think any of them take a ruling against religion lightly, because there are actual people they have in their heads when it comes to who is a religious observer, what is a faith leader. They have the population in their mind of the people they grew up with. And so I think they are very sensitive to religious freedom claims because they understand how significant faith can be in people's lives.
Mm-hmm. We're going to turn to the students in just another minute, so if you all would give some thought to what you want to ask about. I want to hear about the concerns of your editors mm-hmm. in the midst of this writing, because I imagine it can be challenging, and you're going to challenge your readership, and you might challenge your editors.
Yeah.
How do they respond to writing at this level, to writing about these issues?
I think there's two different angles I would take. And one is what we talked about earlier with what are the page views like? And so earlier, last fall, there was 2 weeks in a row where the Supreme Court heard cases about surveillance of Muslims and then access to religious counsel if you're on death row. And I was so excited about the coverage I was doing. I just felt like, oh, I really nailed that. I really explained it well, and I'm excited to see this piece out in the world. But the numbers just weren't there. I just, oh my gosh, probably the lowest page view performance for the month. And I texted my editor and said, what am I supposed to do with this? This is so depressing. And he said, stop putting Supreme Court in the headline, like make people care some other way. And so that don't
stop writing about these issues, and don't stop writing about the work before the Supreme Court, but
you have to wrap it in a different wrapper to grab people's attention. And so that was some tough love that I needed. The other thing I'll mention, and this was something that I probably need to hear in all sorts of contexts, but it's remembering that I am often trapped in the weeds, that I have read all these documents, that I've listened to oral arguments, that I've covered a million of these cases. And so I end up saying things in far too confusing of a way for a general reader, that I have to be reminded to write for someone who's not reading about this hours each week.
I think about public radio, Nina Totenberg, or somebody talking about Supreme Court, and how intentional they are, I think, in carrying me along in the conversation.
Oh, definitely.
And you're talking about those same issues and then overlaying it with the really profound questions of faith.
Yeah.
So I can see how I can get into the weeds pretty quickly.
Well, and as someone who was in a graduate program where you're sort of rewarded for sounding very smart, that you have to teach yourself that that's not what you should focus on. You should focus on helping people understand and bringing them up to what you've been able to learn, and it's not about sounding impressive.
Yeah. Does anyone have a question to start with? Oh, don't be shy. Please, Michael.
In the class you talked about
So in the class, you talked about internal gut checks that you went through. And is there any case in particular that you covered where you went back and in reflection on your coverage, did you do a gut check where, you felt good or particularly bad about how you reported that particular case?
Thank you so much for this question. I have been thinking about that a lot lately because I think the one that comes to my mind was from this last summer. It was the ruling on the Catholic Foster Care Agency in Philadelphia. The case was called Fulton versus Philadelphia. And the reason why I am struggling with the way I wrote about it is that it was somewhat surprisingly a unanimous court, that nobody wrote a dissenting opinion, but it's kind of hard to understand, for a general reader to understand that even though it was a unanimous court, it doesn't mean what it might seem like it means, that they were so narrow in what they decided.
Catch us up on the issue, if you would.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
There was a battle over whether if you're a Catholic foster care agency who doesn't believe in same-sex marriage and doesn't want to evaluate same-sex couples for adoption or foster care placement, whether you will need to in order to abide by the city's non-discrimination ordinance. And so the question was, does the city have to make the agency, or is the city allowed to force the agency to comply with that non-discrimination rule? And what the court said is that the city can't force this Catholic foster care agency to abide by it, that the Catholic foster care agency should be able to still participate even if they won't evaluate same-sex couples. But what I'm saying about narrow is that it wasn't this broad sweeping decision where every foster care agency across the country is now free to set its own policy about what couples to work with. It was pretty specific to the Philadelphia policy, and it was intentionally so that the justices were able to come to that unanimous group because of how they worked to make it so specific. And I still think that having a headline that says Catholic Foster Care Agency wins biggest Supreme Court case of this term doesn't quite capture the nuance, because that's a huge blow to the LGBTQ community to see that. And I wish I had found a better way to say, yes, this is a loss for the LGBTQ community, but it's not the final word on this issue by any means. We should expect many more cases to come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Who else has a question?
Thank you. I'm really interested in these weeds because the Supreme Court is such a complex institution that's made up not only of justices who are appointed by particular presidents who are members of particular parties, but also the cases that they receive come from lower courts and in turn lower courts from there. But any story that you write about them has to have some kind of immediacy, some relevance, that these cases are published, and you must have an interpretation of these cases before the general public relatively quickly after that. And it seems rather intimidating to kind of read all of the histories of all of these pieces that may be relevant in understanding a particular Supreme Court decision. So how do you balance that, the kind of like time frame of just journalism, having to put out reports, with like just the amount of scholarship and sources and kind of information on any of these given issues? Because I imagine that as someone who's got a graduate degree, you kind of love the weeds a little bit to read all of these things and do a deep dive. So when is the deep dive deep enough?
That's a great question. I have tried to approach it by that reporting ahead of the original oral arguments. So starting my homework long before the final exam of the ruling is going to come out. So you can read not only the documents that are filed by the parties involved in the case, where you sort of see them lay out their arguments for what they want the Supreme Court to rule, but you can read these statements and briefs filed by all sorts of organizations that are somehow implicated by the case or feel like the eventual ruling will affect their own work or their own beliefs. And I think that that's how I build up the confidence that you need to be able to move very quickly once the ruling happens, and even once the oral argument morning has taken place and you have to pick up on what matters. It's that you've I've tried to do the reading, at least from the bigger name groups that have filed briefs. And the other thing is, in this area, as all areas, rely on people much smarter than you. I have to get on the phone with legal scholars who I had mentioned earlier work at the intersection of law and religion and have been working at that intersection for decades. And I have to be able to ask them all sorts of questions, and they actually make fun of the type of in the weeds questions I ask and are sort of like, okay, well, when are you going to take your LSAT to go to law school? But I don't plan on that in the future, but I do plan on having many more great conversations with them.
Do you write after both arguments end at the point of decisions, or do you
I
wait for
try
decisions?
to.
Yeah.
That's a little bit in flux just because of what we talked about earlier, is how much content does the audience really want about this?
will they
And
put up
with the oral arguments, and if any of you have watched oral arguments, it's actually incredibly boring. It's not like a court scene on a Law and Order show. It's just this long series of strange in the weeds questions with very strange responses that sometimes get cut off unexpectedly. And so what I've been trying to do is, instead of pull it together into an article, do a Twitter thread about it that says, hey, I just read through the transcript and here's what I think jumps out at me. And I just find that both a little easier on me and also a little bit more enjoyable for the average person, because instead of reading it all in this 1,000-word piece, it's like, let me just glance at a few tweets about it.
So through the lens of a religion writer, what are a couple of upcoming decisions that you have got your eye on now?
Oh, this year has been jam-packed with details. The one that has yet to be argued, that will be argued probably sometime in April, is really interesting to me. It's about a football coach in Washington State that was praying on the field after games. And the question is, was that a private act of prayer, or was he pressuring students and the broader community to take part with him? And the Supreme Court in the past has said, as some sort of authority figure like a teacher, you can't pressure these students to sort of follow your own beliefs. And so it'll be really interesting to see with this conservative majority whether they'll go along with those past rulings about coercion or side more with the religious viewpoint that says, oh, I should be able to pray even if it is in a somewhat official capacity.
I don't know a person of faith who would not have an opinion about that.
Well, and that's why I think that when I write these stories and maybe they don't get the audience, I don't think it's because the audience isn't out there. I think it's because I haven't nailed it with the angle or the headline. So that's why I keep fighting another day.
Sure, that's an exciting one. Yeah. Other questions, please.
So with a lot of these culture war cases, it seems like whenever it goes one way or the other, the side that the ultimate decision is not in favor of kind of reacts strongly as if the sky is falling and it's really bad. And I think it's really telling that that happens on both sides. I don't know how much you feel capable of answering this kind of analytical question when you're not as much a legal scholar as you are a scholar of religion, but what do you sort of take as the Roberts Court's sort of ethos? Like, how does Roberts want this court to be remembered institutionally? Because it seems to kind of go in a lot of directions.
I'm glad you asked that, because it's something I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, and it relates to what we were discussing earlier about that Philadelphia case. Roberts has worked very hard to try to separate the Supreme Court from the political polarization that is happening these days, that he wants rulings to feel very measured. He wants the court to seem more unified than it is generally thought to be. And so if you pay attention to their approach to religion cases, it feels, and it basically is the case, that they work very hard for these rulings to be unanimous or 8-1 or 7-2, instead of it always being conservatives versus liberals, that they find a consensus. And most of the time they do that by finding this more narrow decision where it's very specific to the facts of that one case and it isn't a broad sweeping answer. You would completely miss that, though, if you're right, if you saw the press releases that go out after decision day, or you saw a lot of the even headlines on stories by people like me, because it does feel in that moment like the sky is falling. But Roberts and his the way he's approached it is that he doesn't want that to be the case. He wants it to be like, this was one step in this direction, but we haven't ultimately committed to this path.
you're writing about the Supreme Court, the highest national court in the US Capitol, from and for both the geographical and ideological heartland of America, where people perhaps tend to feel alienated from both coasts and from elitism and high politics. And so I wonder, how big do you perceive that gap, and how do you bridge that gap through your journalism?
Yeah, the question of audience is always important in journalism, but it can be a strange one to apply to the work that I do, because I work at a paper that is based in Utah that more and more is doing regional coverage, but all along has been trying to be a national outlet as well. And I've been working on the national team. And so I think that in general, when I approach the Supreme Court coverage, I may have this focus on religion, but I haven't really tried to make it regional or tried to make it somehow Latter-day Saint-ish. It's just sort of been another take on this national approach. But I've actually been thinking recently about how I could do better in terms of getting more readership at connecting it with this core audience. And I really missed an opportunity recently, because last month the Supreme Court heard a case about Boston and whether the City Hall flagpole was a public forum, to the point where they had to fly basically any flag that someone was hoping to fly, including the Christian flag, for a brief period of time. And I realized when I was writing the story at the last minute that there was a case that the justices were going to be thinking about as they make this decision that was in southern Utah, that was about a government-run park and what types of religious symbols they included in the layout of this park. And that would have been such a cool opportunity to say, here's a national issue, but there's this wonderful chance to think about this community down the street that relates to this case.
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by the way it gets at questions of what your goal is with this readership.
Yeah.
What are you trying to, I mean, you're trying to write good stories. You're trying to write interesting and good stories. What do you think about what your readers how they'll be changed, how they'll be affected, what they'll learn?
Well, I want to teach them something. That's my goal. And again, it's not that I'm an expert who is literally putting together the lesson. It's that I am being able to call up some great experts and then share their thoughts. And I just want to help people understand this really significant institution, the Supreme Court, on a deeper level, because its operations and its rulings are both incredibly splashy and public, but also incredibly misunderstood. That a lot of people don't understand the ins and outs of the Supreme Court and what each little play means and what each ruling will lead to in the future. So I just think by having the time and freedom to do this work, I can help connect the dots and then sort of be that voice for people that says, I know you don't have time to look at all these crazy details, but I'm going to do it, and then I'm going to pass on what I learned.
Do you think you'd write differently if you were in Connecticut or in Chicago or in LA? I mean, would you tell this story differently?
I have to imagine I would, just because audience matters. You have to think about sort of where people are coming from. And like I said, I'm writing for an audience that it can be pretty nerdy about these legal issues and sort of willing to walk into the weeds sometimes. And so other audiences might not be. But it's just hard to say, because as I said, this is a national issue, and so I always think that I'm writing for a national audience. So if I was...
And you're picked up by national media.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen your work.
And so if I'm in Connecticut or in Chicago and writing for a national audience, I have to imagine the article would turn out somewhat the same.
Hi, I guess my question is picking up on the earlier comment about the Roberts' court's attempts to sort of maintain a vision of legitimacy. And I guess my question is, as someone who's been following the court, you probably have been aware that, like, I think people have been feeling that's an open question. The sort of issue with Merrick Garland, Amy Coney Barrett, the sort of now, people would say a 6-3 composition of the court. And so I'm wondering, as someone who has been following the court, do you think that the court is in a sort of precarious position for being seen as like a legitimate part of our federal government.
Oh, I certainly think they are, because I think that efforts by Roberts to keep all of their rulings very carefully written, that only goes so far, because you see justices make public appearances, make statements about the work they do that can very quickly undermine this effort to encourage unity. The other thing I'll mention is that I've been thinking quite a bit about how the court approaches religion issues, because I wrote a story over the summer about how it's surprising how often, or it might be surprising how often, the liberals join with the conservative justices for this sort of pro-religious freedom or pro-religion ruling. And what I pointed out in the story was that, oh, you might not realize this, but a lot of these rulings are unanimous or 7-2. But I talked to a really smart scholar who said, yes, it's true that these rulings are more unanimous than a lot of people assume. It's not conservative versus liberal. But the question is, do the conservatives on the court ever find themselves in that 3 or in that 2? And it feels like it's becoming less often on these religious cases, that perhaps the conservatives are so invested in protecting religious rights that it would be almost impossible to sort of pull them away from that view. And again, it's not that there is some perfect obvious answer in every case. There's so much nuance, but that's certainly what scholars that are more on the left are raising the alarm about, is that it feels like no matter what happened in oral arguments, no matter what was said in the briefs, that maybe you've already lost 3 or 4 of the votes before you got started.
There's been some writing recently about the close influences upon some of the court members, family who have religious perspectives. Is that something that interests you?
Well,
I mean,
I
those
think
are not about cases. Those are about a broader approach to the law and to
right.
religion and morality.
So far, I've left that to the world of sort of DC reporting, the folks that are truly court watchers, that they're able to be there in the courtroom during oral arguments and have access to the justices in a way that I never would from Utah. But sometimes I do worry that I'm maybe not thinking about that deeply enough, that I am a little too academic about the way I approach the court, that I'm too focused on the briefs and the rulings instead of the people. And so I think that is something we all need to pay more attention to in the years ahead, because the court will only become a more important institution as they take on bigger and bigger cases.
Other questions? Yeah, please, Margaret.
You've kind of talked about this a little bit already, and we spoke about it a little earlier in the class, but I'm interested in how, when the different sides of these cases are even framing the debate in very different terms, how do you as a reporter kind of frame the debate? And do you feel like it's your job to kind of show, maybe the different sides equally, or some sort of present some sort of middle ground, or do you feel like, do you sometimes feel you have a responsibility to fact check, one side, if there's a particularly sort of egregious detachment of one side from maybe like the facts of the case, or particularly, do you ever find yourself sort of feeling like you need to not just show both sides, but sort of kind of tether it in some other, reality? Or I don't know, I'm thinking, what's coming to mind is other cases that are not necessarily religion ones, so I don't know if this comes up with religion cases, but yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
That issue just came up this week because I have been starting my research about that football coach case, the prayer, and there is this clear disagreement between both sides about what was actually happening. Was it a man's private act of faith that just happened to be in the aftermath of a game where lots of community members were witnessing it and some students were excited to join? Or was it this intentional, like, I'm going to cause a culture war battle because I want to make it to the Supreme Court, or because I want to make an issue of this? And so that has come up, that does come up. The thing that I think benefits or is important to turn to in the context of legal cases is that there are lower court rulings where the judges have attempted to work out what is the truth here. And if you read their ruling, each one very conveniently will sort of offer a little historical background of like, here's why this case ended up on my desk. And so at the end of the day, I do try to return to this is what this judge has sort of interpreted the facts to be after hearing both sides. But that's a problem in all sorts of reporting, is that you talk to folks on all sides, and at some point you're really wrestling with who's telling the truth here. And I think that if you don't feel comfortable saying, or if you're still very lost, it just means that there's more work to do. You have to have some more conversations.
Let's talk about your theological education. So you spent a couple of years at this place. Do you think that's an important part of the writing that you're doing? It's not a setup for Yale. It's really...
No. I'm so glad you asked that, because when I think about what helped me about going to Yale Divinity School, it's that it taught me everything I don't know. It humbled me. The amount that there is to learn in the world and the very little time I have to learn it. And so even when I write about something that I feel like I've had experience covering, when the Supreme Court hears a case next year that's very similar to the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, I have to always have that voice in my head that says, you don't know as much as you think you do. Call someone, ask the extra question, do the extra reading. And so that was, YDS very helpfully humbled me intellectually.
As you see others writing about religion and as it relates to Supreme Court work, decisions, do you sometimes wish that they knew something theologically that they don't show?
Well, I think that I'm more likely to get caught up or in the fact that they maybe didn't go quite as far into the weeds as I did. That sounds very nerdy, but sorry, that's who I am. But that they've sort of glossed over something that I felt was this very important detail. And they've maybe overstated what this will mean because it makes the headline sound more interesting. And so I think that that is academic in a sense, that you learn to take a very measured tone. And that's a good thing and a bad thing, because maybe that contributes to this low page view situation.
I was wondering on like these two areas of like, I guess we're talking about religion and the law. So oftentimes you kind of play both sides, and I think you mentioned talking about your audience and thinking that, keeping that in mind, and thinking about who has the most skin in the game. I just was wondering how if you could speak to, when you come to maybe the end of a piece, how do you pivot away from this like conclusion, this silver lining, and then do you leave questions? So like, maybe just describe maybe what that process is like for you when you come to the end of a piece.
It's hilarious to think about this in the context of Supreme Court reporting, because any story I write about most cases says the Supreme Court's decision is expected by the end of June. And so that's where you get to end, is, oh, yay, okay. But that's really hard, because do you end with the winner, or do you end with the loser and their sort of heartbreak about what could come next? What I try to do at the end of a piece that's about a ruling is just to point towards, what should we all be looking for? What is the next?
What in society or what in the law?
In society, where are problems going to arise related to this ruling? What type of conflict could come up as a result of this decision? And so it's not this
What
sort
will
of
football fields look like across the country?
well, it's
I mean, at
well
the end of
after the
games,
game.
after the
But
game,
even more
yeah.
than that, it's what do classrooms look like after this ruling? What are teachers now allowed to do because of this potential decision? So that it's sort of taking, we've looked very specifically at this case, at this issue, but let's take a step back and say, how are we as a country changed as a result of what's just been handed down? And perhaps what questions remain, what's left to work out.
Yeah, I think I'm very interested in your line of work, particularly because it seems that with this emphasis on Supreme Court and religion, you're working at this intersection that sees the intersection of these many grand narratives coming together and these many different stories that people are trying to tell. And in particular, I imagine one that comes up frequently is this idea of America and what America is supposed to mean and what America is and what it ought to be. And seeing that the Supreme Court is this institution whose decisions have universal effect on the American people, I guess I would be curious to see how the religious community maybe reacts to this idea of America from what you've seen, what they hope to see become the future of America, and how that might be at variance from other parts of the country that might not share this religious outlook.
There's a couple ways I want to think about that, and how I want to answer it. One thing is that there's a certain privilege that comes with having the time to engage the Supreme Court. Not every church is able to take the time to talk about these cases. Not every denomination is able to hire an attorney to write a brief to get involved in a case. Not every person with a complaint about their religious rights knows what to do in terms of filing the case. And so I try to be very cognizant of the fact that even though I'm working very hard to represent a diverse range of religious voices, I've already chopped off a huge chunk of religious voices just by focusing on the Supreme Court. And the other thing I wanted to mention, which I'm not even sure you were getting at, but it's just something I wish I had said sooner, is that by really studying the Supreme Court and thinking about it quite a bit, you're reminded of how much it is a human institution. I think we're kind of raised to think that the Supreme Court is this inhuman part of the America, the big country, and it represents the country and our ideals instead of just these 9 people and what they believe. And the more you read about it, the more that you listen to the oral arguments, you realize that those 9 people and their personalities really do sneak in, creep in. They affect the way things are written. They obviously affect what questions are asked. And so I think the same is true of religion, and that was another lesson from YDS, is that pastors are people. They're my friends. They're the people I was in class with and sat in the common room with. And so I just am reminded regularly of the humanity of these institutions and the humanity of people who are doing these incredibly important jobs.
Yeah, a lot of questions have already been asked surrounding this, so this might be a little bit repetitive. But I'm wondering, how do you decide what information to include with regard to a plaintiff or defendant's personal faith? And do you tend to include that background information? If so, why? And if not, why not?
I would try to include basically the information that is relevant for that battle. So what is it about that person's religious practice and religious beliefs that got them into this conflict that led them all the way to the Supreme Court? I think that one of the things I've ended up focusing on is the legal, what's going on legally. So what's the precedent that the court is thinking about? What's the question being asked? And I haven't actually dug into the personality side of it that often, and that's something I feel bad about, because I think that the human story is so important. But for the most part, it's just the facts, ma'am. It's just the details that help explain why this conflict arose. Now, one of the reasons why I want to think more about giving more details and helping people really understand the depths and the emotions involved is that sometimes in the courtroom, the judges are questioning the sincerity of the claim. Is this person really as religious as they claim to be? And I don't know that I'm the ultimate arbiter of that, but I would at least like to give readers some sense of how long they've been practicing this faith, what their statements are about it. And so I want them, just as I want people to understand that the Supreme Court justices are human, I want them to see the human side of these challengers involved in the case.
I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a book that came out last year from a legal scholar named Jamal Green called How Rights Went Wrong. He's a legal scholar at Columbia. Basically, the thesis is that there's something wrong with the way Americans view rights, in that we recognize few rights too much, and then most of the other rights not enough, right? And how that's becoming more and more a thing. So obviously civil rights being this huge bucket that includes so many different types of rights, often pitted against religious rights, which is also kind of varied, but at the end of the day, it's rooted in the main concept of religion, I guess, or religious freedom. Whereas civil rights are not as clearly defined, say, in the Bill of Rights, especially in the way we think of civil rights now as they're kind of more developed. So I guess what do you see as the direction for this. I mean, this is like a huge existential question, and we're obviously not going to figure it out today. But like, I mean, the direction that the country is going in, and how, as society becomes more pluralistic, it's harder for the Supreme Court to be legitimate and for it to make decisions that can help support a pluralistic society when we have this long history of precedent that is becoming more and more supportive of only certain types of rights.
This reminds me of the fact that as the Supreme Court has gained conservative justices who are generally very supportive of religious freedom claims, the country as a whole, culture, has become less supportive of religious rights, less involved in religious communities. Organized religion doesn't have the type of involvement that we saw in the past. And so what that means is that there are still probably a decade, 2 decades to come of the Supreme Court really prioritizing protections for religious groups, really thinking hard about how to balance religious rights with other types of civil rights. But there could come a point where suddenly the judges that are on the court are not religious themselves, or weren't religious themselves, or don't really understand the significance of religious freedom claims, because you've kind of lost the culture, if that makes sense. That the culture has focused on something different and turned away from religious freedom, or at least de-emphasized it. And so that's what I think leads to a lot of the consternation today, is that the Supreme Court feels so out of step with the rest of the country in its focus on religious freedom and its rulings in favor of religious freedom. The other thing I wanted to note that came to mind with your question is that when various rights come into conflict, the religion, in some contexts, religion feels like the most obvious one to change, if that makes sense. That if someone's in a clash over gay rights and religious rights, that you can't stop being gay, you can't stop being transgender, but that religious person can change their beliefs. And so that's created a lot of drama, is how much can you expect a religious person to respond to societal or cultural pressures, or how much do you have to adjust the laws to say they also are not going to change? And so I've been wrestling with that, but it's something I think about in the context of this broader narrative of how faith is changing in the country, because soon enough, there's going to be people in positions of powers who are atheists or agnostic, or who weren't raised in a religious tradition, and that really does shift how courts approach religious rights.
You said that you're not you don't want to be Supreme Court reporter, but focus on religion in the Supreme Court. And I'm wondering how you select what is considered religion, and also how you navigate huge milestones that might not have an explicit religion focus. And I'm thinking especially of the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson today, whether you are going to write about that and maybe put a religious spin on it, maybe write a religious biography of her, or whether you're going to wait till there's an explicit religion intersection with that.
I love this question. So first I'll mention that I have mostly failed to do cases that matter because I've been matter that don't have to do with religion, because I've been so worried about the workload of going beyond just the specific religious rights cases. So this term, 5 cases involve a religious freedom type claim specifically, with a religious person involved in the suit. And so I had dabbled a little bit in the abortion rights cases, but I didn't look at them with the same intensity of like, let me read all the briefs, let me analyze this, let me watch oral arguments. And I think that's a problem on my part. I think that we could do way more, because those are the cases that are really grabbing people's attention. And I think there's a religious angle to almost anything if you take the time to think about it. In terms of the nomination, I was smiling because one of the reasons that I have not yet written sort of a religious take on Ketanji Brown Jackson is I'm here with you guys. I'm speaking, I'm leading this class, and so I'm not at my computer all day. But I got a bunch of press releases in my inbox from all sorts of religious groups reacting.
It's only 6 o'clock in Utah.
Oh, don't even give my editor an idea. So I could write a roundup that's just like literally, here's these faith groups reacting. But what I'm probably most interested in at this point, because maybe my opportunity to write something has passed for the day. I need to get some sleep, Bill. Stop pressuring me. Maybe my opportunity is, but during the confirmation hearings, there will almost certainly be questions about her own religious background, her view on religious liberty, her view on how to balance religious liberty with other civil rights. That's a story that can be written, and I think that there will be really interesting dialogue about that.
Yeah.
So I'm just interested in how your own thinking about religion or the courts or the two of them together has changed over the course of 8 years of reporting on them and thinking about them so intensely and thinking about how other people think about them. And if you can think of any moments where that like really shifted your thinking about these issues.
I was so Pollyanna-ish about the Supreme Court when I started covering it. I thought that it was every single case is a completely clean slate. Everyone walks into the courtroom that day and says, dazzle me, what are you going to say? Who's going to perform the best? I didn't realize just how much happens behind the scenes, just how much do you make citations in your legal brief that really appeal to that one specific justice that might be the swing vote. And I sort of, as I learned more about what happens behind the scenes, you learn that those who argue the cases in front of the Supreme Court actually have practice sessions where people pretend to be each of the 9 justices and ask questions in the way that they'll ask questions that you're trying to win over to your side, because they sort of have these biases perhaps that they carry into the courtroom. So I've realized how much of a political game it can be, even though it's separate from the work of Congress, it's separate from the work of the White House. And then I also have gotten much smarter about recognizing what the court has done in a decision and what it didn't do, if that makes sense. That yes, it has issued a ruling and one side has won, but did it win in a huge way? Did it win just today? Did it win permanently? Did it win just until Philadelphia changes its own policy on non-discrimination? So I've just tried to be more careful about the way I describe what's happening, because everything can shift from year to year, from term to term, and you have to always be on the lookout for those little details.
If you were to have the chance to talk to a room full of divinity school students who were writers, what would you tell them to study? What would you tell them to pay attention to in their studies?
Don't specialize too soon, is what I would say. It helps to be a generalist. It helps to have a love for learning that goes beyond a single specific topic, because it will serve you well in all sorts of areas of life. So keep reading, keep asking questions, keep learning, and remember the joy of it, the joy of discovering something. And it can certainly feel like a slog in my job, the times that I do end up going back to a hotel room after a day at a conference and having to write something up really fast. But I try to always give thanks for the position I'm in. And I needed that lesson when I was a divinity school student, that you're slammed with readings, you're drowning in assignments, you're disgusted with yourself for ever coming to graduate school. But it's actually incredibly cool to learn full-time, to meet smart people, to have professors that you really admire and will answer you when you email them. So just don't lose track of the joy of learning.
If you had a whole nother Kelsey to write, to have a writing career, putting aside the Supreme Court work as one of your areas of focus, what else would you be writing about?
Well, this is a spoiler alert for our conversation tomorrow. I would be a sports journalist. I would be
Religion
be writing.
And sports?
No, like
Just
NFL. No, I think that I was too nervous to work my way up the ranks of where you're covering minor league baseball in the rain and you're having a horrible time. Like, I was too nervous about the real grunt work of sports journalism to ever give that a go. But it's certainly where my heart is in my free time, is sort of watching professional sports and talking about it. And I find ways to sneak in some religion reporting on it.
We'll have some conversation about that tomorrow, and that'll be fun. Yeah.
And then if I wasn't a journalist at all, who knows where I would be? Hopefully just some sort of writer, maybe more of an authoress.
Mm-hmm. Still could happen. Yeah. Join me in thanking Kelsey Dallas for being our guest. Thank you.